Welcome, everyone. This is our final Saturday session of our Intuiting Life seminar series. We have two speakers today. One will be the co-editor of this book, Spyridon Kotraphinis, and I will follow up with a presentation about my chapter. For those who were not at the first session, let me introduce Spyridon. He's an associate professor for philosophy at the Technical University of Berlin. Between 2012 and 2014, he was visiting associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley, where he was doing some research with Terence Deacon. He has specialized in process philosophy, including Whitehead and Bergson, biophilosophy, classical metaphysics, and complexity theory. His research focus is the establishment of a new theory of biological organism that is based on process ontology. And he's the author and editor of 6 books and numerous articles and book chapters. As I mentioned, he is the co-editor of Process Philosophical Perspectives on Biology. And today he is going to speak to us about his chapter in this book. Spyridon, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Matt. So I'm going to talk about my chapter in the book. I have changed a little the title because the initial title was The Flowing Bridge on the Processual Teleology and Agency of Living Beings. So the Flowing Bridge is a metaphor that I took from a Zen Buddhist poem of the 7th century written by a Chinese poet, Fu Tashi. But while I was preparing the presentation for our event today, I saw that it would take me very, very long. So I decided to leave out this aspect, why the organism can be seen as a flowing and not as a static bridge. But if you want me, I can talk about that in the discussion. So let me share with you my PowerPoint. So the term teleology was coined in 1728 by Christian Wolff, the most influential German philosopher who lived between Leibniz and Kant. In contemporary biology, 2 different meanings are assigned to the term teleology: end-state directedness and purposiveness. The end state of a biological phenomenon, such as mitosis, meiosis, cell cycle, embryogenesis, growth, foraging, mating, and migration, is the final state with which it reaches its completion. Due to space limitations, this chapter focuses on the aspect of final state directedness of cells and organisms and ignores the topic of purpose or function. In stark contrast to artificial and natural inorganic systems, organismic and cellular processes not only reach their characteristic end states, but rather autonomously create the necessary conditions for the production of these states by profoundly influencing their own material constitution. This essential autonomy of biological beings is subsumed under the concept of agency. The term agency emphasizes the ability of living beings to create the conditions for their own preservation or orderly transformation through their own dynamics. The chapter pursues 2 aims. First, to point out some crucial difficulties in understanding teleological end-state directedness and agency in contemporary biology and philosophy of biology. Second, to show how a process metaphysical perspective of the organism, which is based on the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead and includes fundamental insights from Aristotle's conception of teleology, can help to overcome these difficulties. So the first section is about the organismic end-state directedness in Aristotle's writings. Aristotle is the main founder of the teleological reflection and terminology. His concept of telos is built on the conviction that the final state of a particular living being is something good for that very being. In Nicomachean Ethics, he claims, I quote, that the good, agathon is the ancient Greek word, is that at which all things aim, end of quote, and that the supreme good, ariston, seems to be something final. Accordingly, final states at which the soul of an organism aims are good for that very organism. So Aristotle says that in many writings, for example, in On the Soul, or in his work on the movement of animals, that the soul of an animal, or actually of every organism, strives to reach a final state because it is experienced, the soul experiences it as being beneficial for the organism. The second section about the reduction of end-state directedness to mechanisms of self-organization and the degradation of teleology to a heuristically useful mode of speaking. From the 17th century to the present day, physics and biosciences have been anchored in an abstract understanding of the term system as a set of elements standing in lawful interrelations that are determined, the lawful interrelations are determined by both the nature of those elements and the conditions under which the elements interact with each other. So if you have, for example, a chemical systems, the lawful interrelations between the elements are determined by the nature of the chemical chemical substances, and by the conditions that are imposed to the systems, for example, temperature or external pressure. The result of this development is that organisms are considered complex dynamical systems, the elements of which are non-linearly interacting biomolecules. A dynamic system is defined as an entity, the state of which at any given moment can be described by a limited set of time-dependent or state variables, x of t equal to x1 of t, x2 of t, xn of t. So if you have, for example, a chemical system that consists of n different substances, then you have x1 or x2 are the concentrations of the first and the second substance, and they all are variables. So for this, for the dynamic, for the development of these stage variables can define a mathematical function f that defines a lawful connection between states at times t and t plus delta t. So t plus delta t is the time point that is the immediate next time point to t. The properties of this function reflect the lawful relationships between the elements of the system. The following formula is an abstract depiction of a dynamic system. So the state of the system at the time point t plus delta t is a function of the state of the system at the last time point t. The function f is the most central element of the model. In most cases, f is a system of coupled nonlinear differential equations. In the last formula, the letter p represents a set of control parameters. These parameters represent the conditions under which the interactions between the elements of the system take place. During a process of calculating the variables, the control parameters are usually kept constant. This is a very important point. In the mathematical models, they are usually kept constants, the parameters p, and their values are determined by the model makers, so they are externally determined quantities. While whereas X, the state of the system X, is an internally determined quantity. So in contemporary sciences, real or theoretical causal structures that produce or predict the course and outcome of natural or artificial phenomena are generally referred to as mechanisms. Biological modeling is based on mathematical mechanisms that mostly, not always, consist in systems of coupled nonlinear differential equations represented by the function f in the above equation. The dependence of modern scientific research on mechanisms is so undeniable that it has even received philosophical underpinning. One of the most dynamically developing areas of contemporary philosophy of science is the new mechanical philosophy, the so-called new mechanical philosophy, or new mechanism. According to two of the most influential proponents of the new mechanical philosophy, I quote, "A mechanism for a phenomenon consists of entities or parts whose activities and interactions are organized so as to be responsible for the phenomenon," end of quote. This statement indicates the implicit systems theoretical underpinning of the term mechanism, since interacting entities can only be characterized as parts if they are viewed as elements of a system. Computer simulations of both small and large systems of equations are considered mechanistic explanations. In systems biology, a computer simulation shows how the explanandum results from deployment of a mathematical model that is an abstract mechanism. Philosopher of biology Dennis Walls, he teaches in Canada, I think in Toronto, at the University of Toronto, summarizes what he calls the mechanical worldview, noting that from the perspective of mechanistic thought, I quote, "To explain a natural phenomenon, one adverts to the causal mechanisms that produce it," end of quote. With the assertion that, I quote again, "the goal-directedness is an unproblematic causal consequence of the architecture of an adaptive system," Walls joins the line of the absolute majority of contemporary biologists and Anglo-Saxon philosophers of biology. Walls claims the ability of systems theoretic mechanisms to explain organismic order and thus biological teleology. The inevitable consequence is that his approach shows, I quote, that teleological explanations are allowed, but this does not demonstrate that they are in any way needed, end of quote. It is worth explaining in what sense Walls allows teleological explanations to stand alongside mechanistic ones in biology. Why does he claim that, I quote again, the completeness of mechanism notwithstanding, teleology has some indispensable explanatory role to play, end of quote. According to Walls, the main difference between mechanistic or systems theoretic explanations on the one hand and teleological explanations on the other is that the mechanistic explanations focus on the causal conditions under which teleological explanations pertain, without telling anything about the content of those teleological explanations. I quote, "The conditions required for a teleological explanation can be given in strictly causal terms. One just has to specify what causes the goal-directed behavior. In contrast, the content of a teleological explanation cannot be specified in strictly causal terms. A teleological explanation does not mention the cause of an event's occurrence. It mentions the goal to which it contributes. In the teleological explanation, the goal state figures as a goal in the explanans. No causal explanation does that. Teleological explanations, properly construed, are not a species of causal explanations. End of quote. In this passage, the term causal and cause refer to a category of causes that can be exhaustively grasped by the methods and terminology of contemporary physico-chemical sciences. They may also be characterized as blind causes, meaning that they lack any conceivable form of mental activity. This assumption forbids any reference to concepts such as striving and experience, which imply mental abilities in the explanation of biological and state-directedness. In further explaining his position, Walsh turns to the analysis of the expressions used in mechanistic and teleological explanations, focusing on the linguistic differences between producing and conducing descriptions of events. I quote, "We successfully explain an occurrence mechanistically when we demonstrate that it is produced by some particular mechanism. By extension, we successfully explain an occurrence teleologically when we demonstrate that it conduces to some particular goal. Conducing is just causing. Producing and conducing descriptions of an event are different. They carry different information. The producing description specifies that the earlier event is the mechanism of the later. It tells us how the later event occurred. The conducing description signifies that the later event is a goal. In doing so, it specifies why the former event occurred." End of quote. In other words, while specific mechanisms termed causes by Walsh explain specific effects produced by those mechanisms, the teleological mode of thought emphasizes the role of those events as goals. It is obvious that Walsh's approach equates the essential difference between mechanistic and teleological explanations with the linguistic difference between two scientific ways of speaking. This lines of reasoning based on the typical Anglo-Saxon analytic philosophy focus on the structure of the deployed scientific or philosophical language considers teleology as a mode of speaking. There is a widespread conviction among contemporary biologists that teleology has no metaphysical but only heuristic and methodological relevance to biology. So not just Walsh, but many biologists and philosophers of biology agree that we actually don't really need teleology, but teleology is another mode of speaking and nothing more than that. So again, teleology, according to this position, teleology has no metaphysical but only heuristic and methodological relevance to biology. In the following, I will argue against this conviction and show that biological teleology can only be understood through a radically anti-mechanistic metaphysics and is consequently much more than a mode of speaking. Third section is about organismic teleology beyond mechanistic thought. And the first subsection is about the essential differences between the dynamics of organisms and mechanisms. Systems biological mechanisms share an essential feature. They operate on the same implicit assumption about the roles of different factors, variables, parameters, and equations in the dynamics of biological systems. In previous publications, I demonstrated that in formal models used in systems biology, two clearly distinct type of factors are at work. Intrinsic factors, this is my own term, intrinsic factors of abstract mechanisms include only those factors that are generated by the dynamic of the system itself. That is, the time-dependent variables x of t. So only what is produced by the system itself is an intrinsic causal factor. And it is a causal factor because it influences the development of the system. Extrinsic factors of abstract mechanisms include all factors that contribute to the generation of extrinsic factors, but are not influenced by any intrinsic dynamic. That is, by the respective values of the calculated variables. So anything that is important for the dynamic of the system but is not produced by this dynamic is an extrinsic factor. Parameters are extrinsic factors because they are set from outside. In the mechanisms or mathematical models used by systems biologists, the most complex factor is the system of coupled differential equations that calculates the values of the variables. So the equations are a causal factor. Those systems of equations are mathematical relations between the less complex intrinsic and extrinsic factors. That is, the variables and the parameters. Any mathematical equations that is applied in systems biology has parameters and variables. So the equation is an abstract mathematical relationship between variables and parameters, or between intrinsic and extrinsic factors. In contemporary formalisms, the systems of equations are not influenced by the system's change of states. They are static, which clearly qualifies them as extrinsic factors. As relations between simpler factors, parameters, and variables, they can be characterized as second-order extrinsic factors, or you can also say higher-order extrinsic factors. Analogously, variables can be understood as first-order intrinsic factors and parameters as first-order extrinsic factors. You could also say lower-order intrinsic factors and lower-order extrinsic factors. Since the number of parameters in systems biology mechanisms is many times greater than that of variables, a much higher number of extrinsic first-order factors is in practice being ascribed to these mechanisms than intrinsic first-order factors. So in the last 20 or 25 years, I studied a big number of systems biological mechanisms. And my observation is that the number of parameters is about four times higher than the number of variables, I mean, in the average. The distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic factors can be applied to organisms as well if the terms intrinsic and extrinsic are interpreted as dependent upon dynamic and independent from dynamic, respectively. So now I'm going to talk not about models, but about real organisms. First-order intrinsic organismic factors are all material and energetic quantities generated by an organism that have an effect on its dynamic, such as the concentration of regulatory proteins, scleroproteins, hormones, ATP molecules, the degree of activation of enzymes, the kinetic rates of intracellular reactions, etc., etc. So everything that the organism determines by its own dynamic. First-order extrinsic organismic factors are all factors that affect the dynamic of an organism, but are not affected by the latter. These factors include initial embryogenetic conditions, such as the parental genetic constitution and the endouterine environment of a zygote at the time of its fertilization. So this is the initial condition of embryogenesis. Fundamental laws of nature are other extrinsic first-order extrinsic organismic factors. Fundamental laws of nature that determine physico-chemical processes and environmental and also environmental conditions are a first-order extrinsic factor. Conditions over which the organismic dynamic does not have the slightest influence, such as gravitation, radioactivity, geological processes, solar activity, and the forms and quantities of available energy and matter. The idea of second-order factors applies also to organisms, as we will see shortly. In the following, I will claim that there are essential differences between the dynamic of a real organism and the depiction of this dynamic by systems biological mechanisms. These differences are of the utmost importance in revealing the uniqueness of organismic processuality. They are related with two fundamental faculties of non-living beings. So now I'm going to talk about two fundamental faculties of every organism. And these faculties are fundamental before the background of the mechanistic models, the logic of mechanistic models. So you can, of course, you can discern many fundamental faculties of living beings, but for my purposes, the following two fundamental faculties are very important. So the first fundamental faculty, in sharp contrast to systems biological mechanisms, real organisms are able to change the value of most quantities that in mechanistic models are represented by static parameters, such as kinetic rates and boundary conditions. Current research shows that both unicellular organisms and cells of multicellular organisms are able to specifically control the course of their intracellular molecular reactions through the modification of the binding affinities between single biomolecules, for example, protein or DNA, to their ligands, for example, drugs or inhibitors. This enables the cells to regulate the kinetic rates of particular intracellular biochemical reactions, so that in physiological settings, these rates can vary of orders of magnitudes. These and other contemporary findings correspond with the fact that real organisms are capable of varying more exactly, fine-tuning the values of most of the quantities that in systems biological mechanisms are represented by static parameters. Consequently, in contrast to contemporary biological formalisms or mechanisms, in real organisms, the number of first-order intrinsic factors, variables, always exceeds by many times the number of the first-order extrinsic ones. So much more variables than parameters in real organisms. The second fundamental faculty, organismic faculty, during the growth and regeneration of unicellular and multicellular organisms and the embryogenesis of the latter, a variety of new types of proteins are synthesized and major morphological and physiological changes take place. The modification of their behavior and remodeling of their shape enables cells to, I quote friends of mine who are professors at University of Rome and are systems biologists. So this enables cells to, I quote, exert a reciprocal influence on their microenvironment as well as on gene expression, end of quote. Embryonic processes display an even more radical intrinsicness of the modification of an organism's morphological, physiological, and biochemical structure. During both embryogenesis and the cell cycle, new types of molecules are synthesized. That means new types of first-order intrinsic factors, new types of variables are synthesized. Those examples imply that and this is the second fundamental faculty, the very core of the second fundamental faculty of organisms. The material structure of a real organism, not of a model, of a real organism, is a sequence of permanently generated new relationships between its own first-order intrinsic and first-order extrinsic factors. This means that in both unicellular and multicellular organisms, the relationship between both kinds of first-order factors is itself an intrinsic factor. Since the relationship between an organism's intrinsic and extrinsic first-order factors constitutes its second-order or higher-order factor, if this relationship is intrinsic, then the organism's second-order or higher-order factor is also intrinsic. But as mentioned above, in contemporary formalism, those relationships, the higher-order relationships, are represented by fixed systems of invariable differential equations, or in other words, by second-order extrinsic factors. To put it in a nutshell, in contrast to contemporary biological formalisms, in a real organism, the second-order factor is necessarily an intrinsic factor, or, in other words, there is no second-order extrinsic factor in a real organism. The next subsection, conclusion, the organismic end-state directness transcends mechanistic explanation. The radical self-variation of the material structure during the cell cycle, embryogenesis, and other biological processes cannot be explained in terms of systems theoretical mechanisms alone for the following reason. Mechanistic explanations are based on assumptions that contradict the two fundamental abilities of living beings introduced above. Therefore, we need a form of teleology that is not a mere mode of speaking that leaves the mechanistic thinking attached. In the macroscopic world of our everyday life, we encounter events caused by two essentially different kinds of beings. First, beings that do not experience anything and consequently cannot have any intentions. All kinds of inanimate materiality, I mean macroscopic materiality, and as is commonly assumed, this is not my assumption, but it is commonly assumed, non-animal organisms. Second, beings who have more or less complex experiences, or more generally mental states that enable them to pursue goals, for example, human and animal agents. The first kind of being gave rise to the notion of the blind cause. The second inspired scientists of earlier times and philosophers to speculate about causes that could be described as non-blind. Thus, if there is good reason to believe that blind causes are insufficient to explain real organismic teleology and agency, or the teleology and agency of real organisms, we must assume the efficacy of non-blind causes in living beings. The fourth section, living beings in Alfred North Whitehead's process metaphysics. From a Whiteheadian perspective, living beings are coherent societies of internally related mental physical processes called actual locations. Organisms consist of short-living elementary subjects or actual locations that are coordinated with one another through their mutual prehensions. Therefore, the most essential feature of all organisms, their second or higher order intrinsicness, as well as all the biological abilities that arise from it, must be seen as the result of the relationships between organismic actual locations. Living societies owe their vitality to a special category of actual locations that only occur within them, within organisms, and have two essential characteristics. First, their mental pole, and through it their teleological self-determination, is of particular originality, originality so that their manifestation as physical facts introduces new causal influences into a living society. Second, they are of great relevance for the development of the whole organism or living society because they exert a great influence on its less original actual occasions. Whitehead refers to these particularly creative elementary processes whose role is to bring novelty to living societies as living occasions. A sequence of consecutive living occasions constitutes a so-called entirely living nexus. Entirely living nexus make up the most active and innovative part of the organism. Even in the simplest unicellular organism is such a nexus regnant, says Whitehead. Every multicellular organism consists of a large number of entirely living nexus because such a nexus resides in each of its cells. From my Whiteheadian perspective, it is evident that the ability of the second-order intrinsic factors of cells and whole organisms to continually fine-tune their first-order intrinsic factors is inextricably tied to the entirely living nexus operating within the organismic body. Each of these nexus, to use Whitehead's words, I quote, alters the values in the artist's sense of that term in order to capture intensity under a large variety of circumstances, end of quote. The last section, conclusion, organismic interiority or Aristotle's continuing relevance. In my opinion, in all biological agents, from the simplest cell and unicellular organism to the blue whale, processes take place that strive to achieve a variety of goals. While most of these goals have to do with the intra-organismic biochemical and physiological dynamics, very few, the most complex, are related to the behavior of the organism as a whole in its environment. Only in exceptionally few cases can organismic acts of striving contain conscious representations of anticipated future situations. In all other cases, however, organismic and cellular agency and teleology are based on the not consciously reflected, but merely experienced urges of the agents. Whitehead talks many times about the urgents. Organismic and cellular agents feel the urge that their dynamic reaches certain not yet actualized states. Whitehead's words about the, I quote from Function of Reason, the appetition affecting a final causation towards ideal ends which lie outside the mere physical tendency, end of quote, could easily be understood as referring to what I believe to be the ability of organismic and cellular agents to direct the course of their own biochemical dynamic towards certain end states. These states are aimed for as final states because they are experienced positively by the respective agent. In other words, the agent is attracted to them. This brings us back to Aristotle's essential connection between biological end-state directedness and the notion of the good, or agathon. The connection between end-state directedness and the striving of organisms. So the connection between end-state directedness and the striving of organisms to attain end states that they experience positively, inspired by Aristotle and sustained by Whiteheadian metaphysics, is an indispensable metaphysical complement to understanding biological teleology and agency. In other words, I think that teleology is not just a way of speaking. I think that it is a necessary metaphysical hypothesis. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Spyridon. I am now going to transition to my presentation. So, my chapter in this book was titled On the Place of Life in the Cosmos, Whitehead's Philosophy of Organism and Contemporary Theoretical Biology. Let me say a little bit about myself for those who don't know me. I am an associate professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco in a program called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. And I teach courses there to graduate students in process thought and its applications, mostly Whitehead, but other process thinkers as well. And the applications of process thinking to the natural sciences, the social sciences, the study of consciousness. And I also teach courses on German idealism. So in this chapter, I do a number of things. I try to argue that understanding the possibility of life emerging in this universe requires altering our normal conception of the physical world in line with Whitehead's process relational ontology and his pan-experientialism. And I also engage with some other research programs and paradigms in theoretical biology, in particular autopoiesis, developed by Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana and carried forward more recently by Evan Thompson. So I'll get into all of that. So I begin my chapter by emphasizing the importance of developing a participatory cosmology. And you could think of this as an attempt to approach these topics with an endo methodology, right? And so when we study the living world, the physical world, even when we do theology, we have to remember that we are inside of what we are trying to understand, right? We are physical beings trying to understand the physical world. We are biological organisms trying to understand the nature of life, right? So scientists are part of the universe they're attempting to know. Seems kind of obvious. But I think this often gets forgotten because of some Cartesian residues, a kind of Cartesian hangover, where dualism is presupposed metaphysically and in practice, even while in terms of the explicit theories that naturalistic scientists develop, they will deny that they are dualistic. But the problem here is that very often scientific explanations of natural processes, whether in physics or in biology, because they take this on this mechanistic character, they end up being incompatible with the fact that organisms like us, conscious agents, in other words, exist. And not only do conscious organisms with agency exist, but these organisms, human beings, are capable of natural scientific knowledge, right? So scientific explanations of natural processes must be compatible with the existence of organisms capable of that knowledge, of that type of explanation. And I think the mechanistic account of physics, of biology, undermines its own conditions of possibility. There are cosmological conditions for the possibility of scientific knowledge, in other words. So that the cosmos is intelligible and capable of being understood at all is one of the metaphysical presuppositions of natural science. Whitehead understood this quite well. Immanuel Kant understood this quite well. But I think we'll see the difference between Whitehead's pan-experiential approach and Immanuel Kant's transcendental approach as we move forward here. The point is that both Whitehead and Kant recognize that there are metaphysical presuppositions of science, right? Whitehead says in the very first few pages of Process and Reality, he says there's an essence to the universe which forbids relationship beyond itself. Now, what he means here, what I take him to mean and try to develop in this chapter, is that when we claim to have rational knowledge, unlike in the Cartesian and Kantian approach, where rational knowledge and mind as such is considered almost to be outside of the natural world, providing us with a kind of view from above, a view from nowhere. And this kind of Cartesian approach to knowledge is a pursuit of a kind of external control over a world that is a material world that is entirely separate from us. When Whitehead says that there's an essence to the universe which forbids relationship beyond itself as a violation of its rationality, I take him to be suggesting to us that rationality, rational knowledge, is in fact a function of relationship. And so when we come to know things, we're really building and maintaining relationships with other organisms. We're building and maintaining alliances with other organisms, right? So a stable fact, a stable understanding of a particular system in the natural world is more a function of how we have come to relate to that system, rather than a matter of determining it as though it were some kind of mechanism with fixed laws that it obeys and so on. We have to come to recognize that the way we approach that which we are trying to know, the way we relate to it, is going to affect how that being, that system, that other organism or community of organisms is going to respond to us, right? And so there's a relational aspect to all of our knowing, and this is part of the very essence of the universe as Whitehead understands it. In my chapter, I draw on the work of Hans Jonas, who, in addition to writing some quite important and influential books on Gnosticism, also wrote this book, The Phenomenon of Life, sort of philosophical biology. And he picks up on both some of the important contributions that Aristotle makes to the study of life, but also Immanuel Kant, particularly in the Critique of Judgment, where Kant develops one of the earliest theories of self-organization to describe the living world. I'll get back to Kant in a moment here. Jonas tells a bit of history in this book, pointing out that for primal peoples, the sort of primal worldview prior to the modern age was animistic, and in this context, because life was accepted as the primary state of things, death loomed as the disturbing mystery. So Jonas thinks that for this reason, the problem of death is probably the first to deserve this name in the history of thought. Now, in Jonas's time, ethologists hadn't observed quite so many examples of other animal species sort of mourning the dead, particularly the mammals, higher mammals, elephants, and primates, some corvids. They seem to at least exhibit behaviors that suggest that they also encounter this mystery of death. But it's clear that this awareness of death is something that higher organisms, it's not exclusively human beings, we can, I think, say with some degree of assurance now, but higher organisms become aware of this fact of death and respond to it. Human beings develop whole cultures, religions, and worldviews in response to this. But as the sort of evolution of consciousness unfolded and the modern European worldview was developed out of the scientific revolution, things became inverted. Rather than life being accepted as the primary state of the universe, with death as the anomaly, after the scientific revolution, as this new mechanistic worldview came to dominate, at least in the Western world, but now increasingly around the whole planet, it was death that was considered to be the norm, death as the primary state of things, right? The universe is 99.9999% dead stuff, and living organisms, this thin film on at least our planet, might be somewhat different, and some, at least one organism among this thin film of biological material, human beings, are conscious, right? But this is the anomaly now in our modern world. And so instead of this question that primal peoples asked and oriented themselves around, what is death, modern people tend to ask, what is life? Life itself becomes the mystery. And I think in our time, it's no coincidence that just as we find ourselves entering the sixth great mass extinction event in the history of Earth, a mass extinction that may claim our own species, it's now that philosophers are once again beginning to take the ontological prospects of panpsychism seriously, right? It's as though the prospect of mass death has brought the significance of life more fully into view. So in this context, as we face mass extinction, as we face climate change, as we face this ecological catastrophe, I think our study of life, our biological sciences really have to be understood as quite urgent, right? This is an approach to biology as if life depended on it, because there's a sense in which, the mechanistic worldview it's not just an inadequate theory. It's destructive in practice. It undermines the life systems of the planet. We've been imagining nature as though it were just a machine and relating to it in that way. And as a result, we've gone about destroying and undermining the capacity of the community of life on Earth to maintain itself, right? And so part of a participatory approach to these questions is recognizing the interplay between theory and practice. There's a link between the way that we know and our action, in other words, how we behave towards the world. And in order to develop a more organic biology, I think we also have to develop a more organic physics. And Whitehead's philosophy of organism, I think, is up to the challenge here. In his book, Science in the Modern World, he began to develop this picture of the philosophy of organism. He says in this book, the appeal to mechanism on behalf of biology was in its origin an appeal to the well-attested, self-consistent physical concepts as expressing the basis of all natural phenomena. But, writing in 1925, he says, at present, there is no such system of concepts. So in the early 20th century, physics underwent really a series of revolutions, right? You could almost call it the second scientific revolution, as relativity theory and quantum theory emerged to upset the old clockwork picture of the universe. And Whitehead realized quite early on that these new understandings of the physical world, the nature of matter and energy and space and time, required a new metaphysics, that the old mechanistic ontology that had undergirded science since its inception in the 17th century was no longer adequate to the new data and theories to interpret that data that were emerging in the early 20th century. Whitehead felt that the concept of organism, with some minor amendments from how the ancients understood the nature of organism, was more appropriate to understanding non-locality and entanglement and the relativity of space and time than was the old sort of mechanistic view of particles in the void, obeying merely externally fixed laws and exchanging only efficient causes with one another. Whitehead thought that an understanding of organisms engaged in a nexus of relations with one another, having internal relations with one another, was a more appropriate metaphysical backdrop for this new science. So he developed an organic cosmology, and in this chapter, I also show the resonances between Whitehead's approach and that of Friedrich Schelling, before him and Robert Rosen after him. Schelling was a German idealist philosopher and philosopher of nature who began developing his philosophy of nature in the late 1790s and into the early 1800s, building on Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment, really, and his understanding in that third and final critique of the self-organizing nature of living organisms. Kant recognized that the Newtonian way of approaching nature as elaborate mechanisms was totally inadequate to and could not, in fact, explain even a single blade of grass. And because of the nature of the circular causality that is at play in even the simplest living organisms, Kant famously said there would never be a Newton of the grass blade because of the way in which living organisms seemed not explainable in terms of merely efficient causes. And Schelling picks up on this, as does Robert Rosen. In the 20th century, Rosen says that the universe described by mechanical laws is an extremely non-generic one, and one in which life cannot exist. Far from being a special case of these laws and reducible to them, biology provides the most spectacular examples of their inadequacy. So Rosen is suggesting here that the laws of physics, the mechanistic laws of physics, which are purely efficient in terms of Aristotle's four causes, it's just an exchange of forces between inert particles, say, that this view of the physical world is non-generic, meaning it's too special to account for what he thinks is the more generic form of causation in the natural world, which is on display quite prominently in the biological world. But the idea here is that self-organization is a principle which goes all the way down. It becomes more obvious in the biological world that nature is a series of nested self-organizing processes. But to understand how what we see displayed in the biological world is possible, Rosen thought we need to rethink physics to understand it too in terms of self-organization. And then Schelling, before Rosen, had said this in his book On the World Soul. He says, the particular successions of causes and effects that delude us with the appearance of mechanism disappear as infinitely small straight lines in the universal curvature of the organism in which the world itself persists. So what Schelling is suggesting here is that rather than thinking of organism or living organization as somehow merely apparent and ultimately reducible to what's truly real in nature, mere mechanisms, Schelling is saying, no, it's the reverse. Mechanism is the appearance. Organism is the reality, right? Which is to say, when we see mechanism, a particular succession of causes and effects, right? Efficient causality, we're not taking in the whole picture. We're too zoomed in, as it were. We need to step back and take in the whole and recognize that there is, as he puts it, this universal curvature of the organism in which the world itself persists. So like Whitehead, Schelling sees the universe itself as a kind of organism, and that there's a kind of macrocosm, microcosm relationship here. And so it's not that there isn't what you could call mechanical causes operating at various local scales. It's that they're always ensconced within a larger, more all-encompassing organic process. Now, even more recently, in 2018, a couple of philosophers of biology, Jean Dupré and Nicholson, Daniel Nicholson, I believe, edited this text, Everything Flows, Towards a Processual Philosophy of Biology. And it's a wonderful collection of chapters trying to advance this processual approach to biology. And they do mention Whitehead and acknowledge his importance for the development of process thought. But, and this is in their introduction to this collection of essays, they claim that his work is a liability that's best avoided by serious philosophers of biology. Quote, the panpsychist foundations of Whitehead's system, not to mention its theological character, are hard to reconcile with the naturalistic perspective. So naturalism here, I think, is what I would refer to as a kind of closed naturalism. One could, and many have, including David Ray Griffin, have argued that Whitehead's philosophy of organism is still naturalistic, but it's a kind of open naturalism, you might say, open to the possibility that experience goes all the way down, and open to purpose, or this urge, as Spyridon was describing it, that also goes all the way down. This is still a naturalistic picture, and Whitehead even has this process theology that I think recognizes the natural world as imbued with a kind of cosmic eros that is just a natural part of how creation occurs moment by moment in individual actual occasions, rather than being an imposed sort of teleology that some kind of deistic picture, as Newton had. Whitehead imagines God as part of the world, and the world as part of God. So it's a strange kind of naturalism, perhaps, but I think Whitehead is still offering us a naturalistic picture. But the problem with the kind of closed naturalism that Dupré and Nicholson are defending here is pointed out by Jonas, who thought that Whitehead's philosophy of organism offered one of the only reasonable alternatives to this kind of closed naturalism. Quote, after the loss of the transcendental counterpole provided by dualistic metaphysics, in whose shelter alone an unadulterated materialism in physics was rationally possible. So what Jonas is suggesting here is that the kind of closed naturalism that says, no, there's no experience in nature, there's no purpose, there's no eros or urge in nature, that this kind of closed naturalism actually presupposes, at least implicitly, a kind of Cartesian dualism, right? As if the mind of the knowing scientist was not properly part of nature, but just a neutral outside observer, right? So to understand life in this closed naturalistic way, as empty of intrinsic purposiveness, as devoid of experience until some magical level of complexity is passed, it's still residually Cartesian, right? It depends on this transcendental counterpole provided by dualistic metaphysics, as Jonas puts it. A participatory approach to these questions, as I introduced earlier, requires just totally inverting this transcendental picture so that mind becomes ensconced within things themselves, right? Rather than there being any room for an outside observer to peer into the universe from beyond. We have to put ourselves, our scientific inquiries back into the universe. And I think Whitehead's pan-experientialism allows us to do that. And so in that sense, it's more naturalistic than this closed, residually dualistic quasi-naturalism, or pseudo-naturalism, let's call it, that even Dupré and Nicholson, despite the wonderful work that they're doing, continue to presuppose. So to move on now to the autopoietic approach to biology, I was quite lucky to be exposed to Matrana and Varela's work and Evan Thompson's work as an undergraduate when I was studying cognitive science. And their approach to understanding the nature of life, I think, is still quite powerful and provides much in the way of resistance to mechanistic reductionism in the life sciences. I mentioned a few sessions ago Francisco Varela's last paper with Andres Weber, titled Life After Kant. And in that paper, they draw on Whitehead a little bit and try to establish the reality of purpose in the living world, right? Not as Spyridon was suggesting, not as a mere as if or a description that human beings are projecting onto the living world, but no, really, organisms are purposeful creatures in and of themselves, right? So Varela and Weber write, on a material, concrete level, we can observe in the organism the flip side of mechanical causality, a final causality, as the basic process of life itself, the establishment of an identity. But this happens not by revising physical laws for particle interactions in special application to organisms, nor by imposing an extra mechanical entelechy. It is rather the subject pole that is the organism in its autonomy, which changes linear causality by structuring matter in the process of self-realization to maintain itself as this very process. Right? So an autopoietic system is not only a self-organizing but a self-producing system, right? That produces a membrane that defines itself over and against an environment. And as we'll see on the next slide here, this account of the autonomy of organisms, I think, is something like what Whitehead means by the self-creation of actual occasions of experience on the metaphysical level. But I worry that autopoiesis, in fact, leaves us with a kind of naturalized monadology, similar to Leibniz's view of monads that were windowless, right? Because as we'll see, I think there's a kind of new kind of dualism that autopoiesis introduces. The dualism between mind and life is, I think, overcome brilliantly, but there's a new dualism between life and matter, as we'll see. Now, in his more recent work, Evan Thompson, who was a student of Varela's, has recognized this remaining gap, even if the gap between mind and life is overcome such that, even single living cells are understood as cognitive systems. There's still this gap between neutral physics and chemistry, as Varela and Weber refer to it, and the purposiveness of life. But Thompson has been coming closer to a kind of pan-experientialist perspective, or at least neutral monism, as he says in his book, Waking, Dreaming, Being. Physical being and experiential being imply each other and derive from something that is neutral between them. And he has a new book coming out early next year that I know draws probably on Whitehead more than any other figure. It's co-authored with Adam Frank and Marcelo Gleiser, both physicists. And I'm very excited about this text, The Blind Spot, Why Science Cannot Ignore Human Experience. And so over the years, I've seen Thompson come closer to, as a result of studying Whitehead, come closer to the sort of position I'm going to put forward here, which I see as not in conflict with autopoietic biology at all, but a kind of ontological or metaphysical supplement to it. So to further unpack what I was describing before, this is the picture of autopoietic biology that comes out of Varela and Maturana's work. And this quote here that I've highlighted comes from the Life After Kant paper, where Varela and Weber write, organisms can be said to transcend the neutrality of pure physics to create their concern. Only their concern for life. Only this organic perspective actually has the status of world. Only this is real, because the living can only act in the form of such an intentional world. Life is thus always subjective in the strong sense of the word. So what's depicted here, these circles are organisms, right? And within the organism, as a result of the self-producing network of processes, a kind of subjective concern arises, right? So the organism's purpose is to maintain itself. It is concerned with maintaining itself, surviving. And these internal dynamics are described as operationally closed, which is to say the normal approach that objectifying science would take to the study of life is to say, well, there are inputs and outputs, right? So the sensory organs, or in the case of simple cells, just the membrane, is receiving stimuli from the environment. Some kind of mechanical process happens inside to respond to that stimulus and produces an effect, motor action, say. Now, what the autopoietic perspective points out is that everything going on inside of this self-producing organism has a kind of operational closure, such that the most you can say about its relationship to the environment is that it is perturbed by the environment, but how it responds to that environment is totally dependent on the ongoing dynamics internal to that organism. Now, obviously, organisms are related to their environments, and the term structural coupling is used to understand how organisms co-evolve with their environments and other organisms, of course. But it's a bit like Leibniz's monads in the sense that, this relationship of structural coupling to the outside world of merely neutral physics is not exerting a causal influence, at least in the sense of something informational, something that is relevant to the subjective perspective of the organism. That subjective perspective brought forth by the autopoietic dynamics of the organism is closed really to any influence, informational influence to the outside. And so it's a kind of solipsistic picture, I would suggest. Now, how does this differ from the process relational ontology that Whitehead gives us, that I think can provide some supplement to autopoietic biology? Well, for Whitehead, first of all, it's organisms all the way down, right? There is no realm of merely neutral physics that would not also be imbued with experience to some degree, of some lesser intensity, right? And so rather than this realm of just neutral physics that precedes life and having to explain this new gap, even if the mind-life gap is closed and cognition is equivalent to autopoiesis in the autopoietic approach, there's still this new gap, right, between life and neutral physics. In Whitehead's view, it's organisms all the way down, and these organisms are, through their physical prehensions of one another, internally related. But even while they're internally related, at least to the actual occasions in their past, they're still self-creating. Whitehead will point out that contemporary actual occasions of experience occur in causal independence of one another, right? And so there's elbow room for self-creation, even while each newly emerging occasion of experience remains internally related to every creature to come before it, right? And so you get this nexus, or this network of relations to the past, even while in the present moment of concrescence, there's a self-creativity, there's an ability, as Spyridon was pointing out, for the mental pole of actual occasions to ingress novelty, to not be determined by any root of physical inheritance in their past. And so this is the major contribution I hope I can make in this chapter, which is to both affirm some of the core insights of the autopoietic approach, while also overcoming this residual dualism between life and neutral physics. I think Whitehead's philosophy of organism provides the missing ontology for autopoietic biology, which without that missing process relational ontology remains basically a transcendental point of view on life. So that's all I have for you. Let me stop sharing my screen here. All right. Thank you, Spyridon. Thank you, Richard, in the background, making all of this work so seamlessly. And thanks to the Cobb Institute. And thanks for everyone for turning out, for your attention, for your questions. This has been a lot of fun.